Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis, the Praise of Folly podcast. I am again joined by Master Sanders. We are here to discuss why the religious right failed. So, to sort of contextualize this, relatively recently we had a video on the religious right was right. And by that we meant the religious right made a series of predictions in the 80s and 90s that were more or less universally scoffed at, not only by mainstream culture, but by certain subcultures then, which appear more relevant now because of their internet presence. And then one of the follow-up questions might be then, well, if it was so right at sort of reading the signs of the times as the men of Issachar, why did it fail? Why did it have this lightning in a bottle, if so to speak, and then fail, where the religious right really doesn't exist at all anymore, except as a sort of bad memory to many people? And I think there's many reasons why the religious right ultimately failed, and I think we're going to sort of start from the top. The goal or the task that the religious right had assigned itself, winning the culture war, fighting all of these issues at the national level, was really not something that they could do. They bit off a lot more than they could chew. If we look at the forces behind these cultural shifts in the 80s and 90s, as I've mentioned elsewhere, were often had large corporate backers or large political machines that allowed them to generate what I would call a near constant pressure on society for these messaging. The religious right just never even had not even a chance to meet that kind of messaging. And one key failure of the religious right in this regard is that with the left, especially, they essentially have a professional revolutionary class that is, or what Lenin would have called the vanguard. These people that are always agitating all of the time, they don't have a job. In fact, they just get paid to agitate. That is their job. And so the forces that were arrayed against the religious right understood the importance of having professional vanguards to continue to push the culture in the direction they wanted. Whereas we never really had a parallel to that in the religious right, even a little bit. There was never these, what we might call professional vanguards that were just fighting for what we might call Christian principles in society. We had spokesmen, but that was not their primary goal. They were either pastors or leaders of parachurch organizations, or maybe some sort of grassroots person that just sort of rose up to be influential. But none of them, but they all had other obligations, other things that they had to do. And so they were sort of fighting with at least one hand behind their back versus these professional vanguards. And in part, they didn't do that because they didn't have the resources that the left had. But one could also argue that the resources they did have were not used to the most efficient effect. But given the limitations of organization, the limitations of finances, the limitations of manpower, and finally the limitations on a sort of professional vanguard, they were never equipped to fight and win the culture war. As such, they in hindsight, you could argue, were doomed to fail because they were taking on a project too big for the capacity that they actually had.
Well, and to be fair to them, this was not the battleground of their choosing, in the sense of they did not wake up one day and say that we're going to fight this on the national level. A lot of these things were forced by the courts of the mid 20th century that kind of pushed these out onto a national stage, where previously you could argue they could be worked on a local stage. A lot of this does go back to the activism of the courts beginning in the late 1940s and early 1950s, and especially took off in the 60s with the ending of prayer in schools, and of course the striking down of contraception laws like in Griswold v. Connecticut in the late 60s, and ultimately with Roe v. Wade in 1973, which overturned abortion laws throughout the country and forced what was primarily a state domain into a national one. So to be fair to them, this was not a battlefield of their choosing. They were sort of forced to fight on a larger scale. But yeah, I think that's perhaps the problem in general, is that if you're going to fight on a national scale, especially in the age before telecommunications really took off in the way that it has within recent years. That made coordinating some of these things far more difficult, arguably. And as you mentioned, trying to bite off more than you can chew, because on the one hand, they're trying to get legislation passed, and on the other hand, they're trying to elect a candidate, and on the other hand, they're trying to enforce some levels of decency and morality on television and the culture. And trying to do all these things at once, they came off as being all pervasive and power hungry, to be frank. And it was some of the more radical elements of the movement, people like Rushduni, were soon used to paint a broad brush over the whole movement as that this was basically the American Taliban. And that's part of biting more than you can chew, contributed to their PR problems, which in turn, I think was part of the steep climb upward to achieve their goals, which made it ultimately impossible for them to wage the culture war.
Yes, the other sort of national level failure, if you will, is they, and this is something that I've sort of seen having grown up within the milieu of the religious right, is that there never really was a vision of what the end state of this struggle would be. There'd be a lot of buzzwords like taking America back for Christ, or returning back America to its Christian roots, or this or that, a moral majority or whatever. But when you get past the buzzwords, like what exactly does the end state of this struggle look like? What are we struggling towards? As the religious right, and the religious right never really articulated what that would look like. I guess the closest thing you could point to, what, as you have said, been Rushduni. But even in some of the other episodes we've done, even Rushduni didn't have a fully well-rounded, fully orbed view of a theonomist or Christian America, and in part because they didn't have this unified vision of what they were trying to achieve. A lot of their efforts were just misspent, because they weren't spent on a task that could have yielded results, because they weren't even sure what they were going for. And then furthermore, by leaving this vacuum of what their end state would be, it allowed the enemies of the movement to then invent their own. And they invented, a dystopia, so that's because, the old religious right couldn't say, well, no, that's wrong, because here's what we actually want is the end state. Well, they didn't have an end state. The closest thing that I can think of where in any sort of popular culture or even remotely serious sense, an end state for the religious right was portrayed at all in any capacity was in Adventures in Odyssey, where the city of Odyssey seems to be what, again, the flagship organization of the religious right was focused on the family, what they envisioned their kind of society looking like. And except for everybody being nicer and, less corrupt and less, willing to take advantage of someone, nicer, basically. It's difficult to see a stark distinction between that and a kind of generic 1980s, 1990s small town America, which, again, if you're going to fight on this national level, that's just not going to cut it.
Exactly. Now, you might be able to attribute that to the idea that conservative Christians were arguing that they were, in some ways, almost the true Americans, right? I used to think that a lot of the emphasis on the United States as being a Christian nation, or at least in its origins, were at best exaggerated by many of the proponents of the religious right. But from my own research and from the other things I've read, especially on the local level, that very much was the case, especially in the founding generation. There's actually been a lot of good scholarship to demonstrate that America was largely a Christian nation, especially influenced by Northern European Protestantism. And that these ideals, whether they were actually believed or not, were so much in the air in the United States that even people who were not particularly religious, people like Thomas Jefferson or Benjamin Franklin, echoed a lot of Protestant maxims and Protestant ideas. And so I think the religious right possibly thought that if you could say that they had an end game, It was to return to some sort of idealized United States, much like you said in Adventures in Odyssey. I guess another good example might be Mayberry, sort of the small town vision of neighborliness and no, I guess that's probably the best you can do it. But I think also they overestimated, or sorry, they underestimated how pervasive a lot of liberal influence and shifts in the culture that had happened over the course of the 20th century to make such a return to this kind of idealized United States impossible, simply because that United States, depending on how you define it, may have disappeared as early as the 1830s. So I guess that's what they could say, is that they would say that they were the true Americans in that sense. They just wanted to return to a generically conservative America, reinforced by more explicit Christian principles. But you're right, the vagaries of what they actually wanted allowed for their enemies to portray them in any manner they wanted to, and oftentimes unfairly.
Exactly. So for example, this is something that it's not a unique fault of the religious right, and I've seen many other movements make the same mistake. They have this idea that all Americans are more or less just like them, except the bad people in certain political parties and the bad people in the media. For example, you'll hear this from like the left on the range from anarchists to social liberals. Oh, well, the majority of Americans side with our policies. It's just, the evil Republicans and Fox News. Whereas, the religious right would tend to say, well, most Americans side with us. It's just that, it's the ACLU or the Democratic Party or the media. And the problem is, well, it's part of it is, in order to be relevant, they have to have this democratic lingo, and they have to appeal to everybody being just like them. Because if you can't make that appeal successfully, then you're kind of dead in the water in a society that's this democratic. But it's just not true. And as I said elsewhere, there isn't really a majority at all anymore in this country, and there might not have been a majority since the 1960s, where instead of having large social blocks, you have, radical individualism where, everybody's the chairman of their own political party. And they just have some issues they happen to agree on and some issues they happen to not agree on. And I think that lacking that self-awareness, they acted in a way that they were not warranted in acting. They thought they had more support than they did, which might also explain why they weren't as efficiently organized and as I mentioned earlier. And second of all, they did correctly identify culture as a key area where this fight would go on. And they could point to the movies and the music put out by Hollywood and Nashville as, these key culture changing things. And so they tried to create, the Christian alternative to X, whether it be video games or movies or novels. As far as it comes to video games and movies, it was more or less an abject failure. When it came to novels and music and radio, we did a bit better. So, in radio, of course, we had focused on the Family's Adventures in Odyssey, which, is considered almost single-handedly revived radio as a genre and an art form in the present age. We had, the best-selling books by Frank Peretti, his thrillers, and the best-selling books by Tim LaHaye about the end times, Left Behind. Both of whom authors were on the New York Times bestseller list. And we had, pretty good music with, Phil Keaggy, who, was reported by many to have been one of the greatest guitarists of all time. But even when we did provide culture that was on par, to compete with the secular world, what did that actually accomplish at the end of the day? That cultural cul-de-sac, if we want to call it that, I think ultimately yielded no results, no significant results in shifting the culture. The drift towards the direction the religious right was warning us about has continued apace, and even the good cultural artifacts didn't really delay that at all. And so I think in the long run, it was just misplaced energies based on the false assumption that most Americans would totally agree with us if they heard the right narrative.
Yeah, you're right. And of course, Republicans and Democrats, or at least ideologues on both sides, tell themselves that all the time. supposedly 60% of voters actually want socialized medicine, and yet they keep voting against the candidates that offer it, kind of tells you that's not really the case. And even if most Americans, let's say, for example, on the issue of abortion, express mostly pro-life views, they don't necessarily demonstrate that with their voting patterns. But you're right. I think the America that many evangelical Christians thought that they were saving or they were fighting for uh, may not have existed, or at least they exaggerated to the extent that it did exist. As for the kind of, we have to do the Christian alternative to X, a lot of that was driven by Focus on the Family in their attempt to kind of, not just be a negative voice, right? You kind of hear that all the time on the religious right, but to offer a positive alternative. That way that, as opposed to abstaining from this at all. And it had, as you said, mixed results. VeggieTales probably was one of the more successful ones as well. There's a couple others that didn't quite get off the ground in the same way in terms of cultural relevance, like Focus on the Family production, McGee and Me, which is kind of like their Christian alternative to the Wonder Years. And oftentimes is that when Christians would try to create their own alternatives, two things would happen. Either A, it would pale in comparison to what they did, to the original, and often laughingly so. Or B, they would get so good that they would become absorbed into the machine of Hollywood and Nashville themselves. Maybe one good example is Amy Grant, who was quite big in the 90s, and who was even doing commercials in terms of her music for Target, right? So she had, many ways, penetrated the mainstream. But unfortunately, I think a lot of her music, at least at that point, was part of like the Jesus is my boyfriend kind of genre, where it's hard to distinguish between what's Christian and what's just, okay, what's talking about God and what's talking about your boyfriend. And even Phil Vischer, who has trended much more leftward in recent years, the creator of VeggieTales, admitted that when he was trying to produce VeggieTales, and he wanted a big idea to play with the big boys, people like Disney and Nickelodeon and others, he acknowledges that he actually missed quite a bit of the actual Christian teachings of the Bible and focused more on just sort of this generic morality, which was one of the costs that early VeggieTales had to make. So in general, it's very difficult to strike that balance between quality without getting absorbed into the machine, or just coming up with a laughable, pale alternative that ends up creating more derision than you intended. And I think that's probably part of the problem. Well, that is the problem in trying to play catch up with the standards that the world sets.
Well, exactly, and I think we'll return to that a little bit later. But the other element too that marks the religious right, which in hindsight was a complete disaster, was the rise of the parachurch organization, which obviously one of the most famous is Focus on the Family, which I think came out in the late 80s. And I don't know if there were any before then, but I think Focus on the Family was the first one to really make it big. And a lot of these Christians relied on the goodwill and the finances of these parachurch organizations to, quote, fight their battles, unquote, for in the world, in the public space. Because, the argument would be like, well, how could I, challenge these structures, these authorities, by myself? I can't do that. We'll let these, pastors, or what we may call superstar pastors, or say, John Piper, or Al Mohler, or parachurch organizations like Focus on the Family, or Christian parochial schools. Now, there had been Christian parochial schools for many years, many decades before the rise of the religious right, but with the rise of parochial schools, seminaries, parachurch organizations, and superstar pastors, there was this whole galaxy of intermediate institutions beneath the state and above the church congregations that sort of became the self-important leaders of the religious right. And what we've seen is that once they achieved a sufficient level of security in their position, they completely jettisoned almost all of the positions that they held when they were religious right advocates. So it wasn't even so much that there was a clean sweep where the people that we put in those institutions were taken out, many of those people are still there. They've just completely repudiated what they purported to stand for when they were being pushed in those positions in the 80s, 90s, and even early 2000s. Now, we could argue whether they were ever honest actors to begin with, or whether the incentives and pressures of maintaining relevance in a parachurch institution corrupted them. We'll get to that a little bit later. But this whole, it almost reminds me of the Israelites when they asked for a king. Who will go for us to fight in the battle against the nations? We can't do it ourselves, so we'll have to have these, these anointed ones do it for us. And they've completely betrayed the cause.
Exactly. Now, parachurch organizations, you can kind of see why they emerged or how they emerged. And that was just the nature of the fight. Individual churches would have a difficult time fighting these national level battles. And so it seems to make sense that a parachurch organization like a pressure group or lobbying group might make the most sense, because you could leverage a number of churches and a number of individuals and use that to buy influence in the larger sphere. And so again, on a technical level, that seems to make sense. But then again, when we look at, let's say, the Bible itself, going from a theological standpoint, there doesn't seem to be really anything outside the churches themselves, unless you count the apostles. And the apostles were in a very special position by virtue of their office. But God seems to the New Testament seems to prescribe a largely congregational approach to ministry. And I think a large part of that is because the issue of discipline. Jesus in Matthew 16 talks about the importance of discipline, and how that's to be done in order to create a level of accountability within the congregation, whether it's a minister or a member or what have you. Parachurch organizations are virtually unaccountable to anybody. I mean, they're not accountable to a church body, and in many cases, they're not even accountable to a denomination. They're accountable ultimately to their trustees. And you might have an instance where the trustees will grow a spine and they may do something like, for example, the trustees that were running Vision Forum when they confronted Doug Phillips for some of his bad behavior. But for the most part, these organizations are run by the celebrity leaders, whether it's a James Dobson or a John Piper or what have you. And these organizations have no accountability outside the organization itself. And so that gives them a lot of leeway to fall into what you've seen today with a lot of these groups going left or going woke. And that in and of itself, of course, is very concerning, because when the goal becomes power, and that becomes the end as opposed to the means to achieve your goal, then that allows for these organizations to kind of run rampant into some very dark theological corners that you never think they would have gone in. But that's basically what's happened within the past couple of years.
Well, exactly. And I think another corollary to all this was the rise of the church growth movement, which ultimately affected both what we might call the evangelical left and the evangelical right. And one of the problems with that was that it viewed church growth as really just as mundane as more people in the pews. And what basically that ended up happening was it ended up watering down the actual quality of the people involved in this. And of course, partly what drives the desire for having more people in the pews is more tithes, right? It becomes a money-making operation. And it does seem that a lot of this did devolve into a money-making operation, precisely just to get more bodies in the pews, which, if we look at, say, the story of Gideon, right, it's not that God wants a large, quote, army, unquote, to fight. He wants it small, because the larger the amount of men and women committed to the fight, the more likely we are to take credit for it. As Jonathan said to the shield bearer, God can deliver us with as many or as few as he wishes. And so this idea that we need to have lots of people, which we see with the church growth movement, but I think also with the religious right, with their idea that we are the majority. It's called the moral majority, right? This majoritarian thinking. That's fundamentally not a Christian way to think. The Christian or even, the Jew doesn't think in terms of majoritarianism. He thinks in terms of, God will deliver with as many or as few as he likes, and he generally chooses the fewer number.
Well, and it's not even just that with the growth movement. We've been growing in many ways in the wrong ways. We do have methods of growth that are prescribed in Scripture, and that is largely through the family. In fact, in Malachi 2, God outlines the two reasons for marriage is one, to the first place, to make them one, which we know in other passages is a demonstration of God's relationship with the church, but in the time of Malachi, God's relationship with Israel, and the other being the raising of godly seed. Now, the Mormon Church, which has sort of an interesting relationship with the Christian right in general, but the Mormon Church is actually bleeding members. They've had, especially with the advent of the internet and the proliferation of a lot of information that was previously unknown to many Mormons, such as the fact that Joseph Smith did not translate directly from the plates, but from a stone and a hat, or that Joseph Smith had up to 40 plus wives, at least. These things were known, but because of geography and the control that the Mormon Church exhibited over its members, most of these things were kept hidden from the average Mormon out in Utah. But with the advent of the internet, much of those barriers have been broken. And a lot of people have left the church because of unsavory things that they have learned regarding their church's history. Now, the thing is, though, that the Mormon Church might be bleeding members, but they have been able to replace them effectively because Mormons are more likely to encourage their members to have large numbers of children, which is an outgrowth of Mormon assumptions about anthropology and salvation. But Mormons are more likely to have larger families on average than people that are not Mormons here in the United States, and especially more than a non-religious household. And the Mormon Church will probably be able to sustain itself for another generation or so, even with some of these more embarrassing things that are coming through the internet and disiluding their members. The problem is, though, within Protestant churches, as we touched on previously in another stream, that the Protestant church since the 1930s has sort of accepted birth control as being a legitimate option for children. And many, the fertility rate and the replacement rate within the evangelical church mirrors that of the world in many cases. So it's not that the evangelical church was wrong for wanting growth, but the growth that they sought was not a healthy one and is not a biblically prescribed one. And as a result, the church still has fewer people and is still in a sharper decline as ever.
Yeah, exactly. And there's the other element here too, which is the nature of this culture war. So, from a Christian point of view, we're always in a state of war against Satan and the principalities and powers. We're always in spiritual warfare. Now, there are prescribed rules for fighting that spiritual war, but and of course, the religious right would often conflate the cultural war with the spiritual war, and there are points of contact to be sure. But one of the things that I think overall hurts the religious right is that it sought to fight the culture war a lot more like the way Sun Tzu says to fight a war than the way Christ says to fight the spiritual war. So Sun Tzu says that all war is deception. And I think when you start thinking like that, you can't serve God and mammon, you can't serve two masters, and it's not just about money. It's also about, success, if that's your master, or winning, or growth or whatever, If those are your masters, they have their own set of demands, their own set of requirements to achieve that may or may not be compatible with those requirements that Christ places on you. And so there seem to be three areas at the state and national level that they sort of focused on. One was, of course, politics, elections, laws. Another one would be sort of business and economics, becoming financially successful so that you could have the donor money to sort of a slush fund, if you will, to pay for your own pet projects and sort of push people around. And, also educational institutions, taking over colleges, taking over universities, or building your own along the same lines as the world. And the problem is all of these institutions have to be successful in a sort of worldly sense, successful in a worldly sense, have a series or set of values and ideal traits that one has to cultivate and possess to be successful, which in many ways are diametrically opposed to the gospel. So, for example, all war is deception. The Apostle Paul says that we should put away lying from one another. The whole corporate angle, which is often subsumed into the concept of dominionism. One of the weaknesses that we pointed out earlier in another stream about Rushdoony was that dominionism on economics is little more than baptized Milton Friedman's supply side economics, which that's obviously not what Moses was teaching 3,000 years ago. But that's sort of what it boiled down to. And of course, a whole lot of assumptions there come in, which are diametrically opposed to the gospel. And I think the key thing that explains the fundamental change, not just in the leadership, but even amongst many of the parishioners, is that they have so invested themselves in fighting battles these ways, fighting, as a party machine operator, fighting in the terms of, building a business that can then compete with the businesses funding left-wing projects, or to take over educational institutions, fight this education battle. Those values that it took to be successful in that arena, the killer instinct, deception, being cold-blooded, if you will, ended up backfiring and bleeding into the actual church structure itself, to the point where in many cases the same kind of pathologies that exist in those areas of education, business, and politics also exist in the church. And all I can say is they should have known better, because, as Christ said, you can't serve God and mammon. You're going to have to serve one or the other.
And this has opened up the Christian right to all sorts of charges of hypocrisy, especially when it comes to economics or when it comes to war. It did not help, for example, that both George W. Bush and Tony Blair more or less had a sort of religious veneer in justifying the war in Iraq, which opened them again to all sorts of charges that, we can't be ruled by people who are obviously religious because they get us involved in quagmires and things like this that make no sense. And in reality, it wasn't, of course, just simply the religious right that gave birth to the new atheism. There was also Islam as well. But a lot, as you said, the inconsistencies of applying biblical principles and playing the world's games, and which involve inevitably engaging in the world's vices and pathologies, is what has opened the church up to charges of hypocrisy. And that severely damages the reputations that Christians have. I think one of the most infamous examples regarding the religious right was Ralph Reed. Now, Ralph Reed, I think he's still active. He was one of the founders, if not the founder, of Christian Coalition, which later became the Faith and Freedom Coalition, as it sort of sought to embrace Tea Party. But Ralph Reed, in the mid-2000s, ran for lieutenant governor in Georgia. Now, people found out that in his lobbying efforts, he had actually made some deals or had some dealings with Indian casinos, which seemed to have been very much out of place with his purported Christian leanings and his purported evangelical leanings. And these charges of hypocrisy were in many ways what sunk his campaign. And he could have been governor of Georgia later had he not been had this not happened, had this news not broken. And so, yes, because he was playing the system and having to work within the system, and that includes working with people who are unsavory and contrary to your beliefs, you run the risk of actually taking in many of those pathologies and risks in your own praxis and in your own beliefs. And that's basically what the religious right has done, and as much as they pretend otherwise, the religious left has done as well.
Well, exactly. It's almost like the system keeps everybody just a little bit dirty, so that if anybody gets too big for their britches, they can sink them. The other thing that sort of ties into all of this, the lack of accountability, playing by the world's games, led to a couple of high-profile scandals. We can think of, for example, Jimmy Swagger from the Assemblies of God, or as you mentioned, Doug Phillips, which severely tarnished the reputation of the religious right and severely, and again, why was it that these scandals were allowed to happen? Why is it that they happened? Well, because these men were in institutions that were unaccountable, and they were unaccountable because they were structured after worldly models, which of course don't have accountability, and they got as far as they did because they were winners, right? These were the guys that would get you what you wanted, and that means to being quote unquote a winner in the sense of the world basically means being a sociopath. And so you basically end up promoting, say, sociopaths because they're the ones that are going to be the best capable of winning your cause in these public disputes. And again, a lot of this is the result of not following a sort of biblical mandate in dealing with these issues. And we see again how playing the world's game ended up hurting the religious right more than it helped, because they'd be like, hey, you're supposed to be better than this, but look, your guys are just as bad as our guys. So what's the real difference? Again, it did not help. In fact, that was probably worth 100 divisions for the enemy, to be honest.
Well, very much so, because the power that Christians have in influencing the culture doesn't lie necessarily in playing the games that the culture sets out, but rather in being different. And in fact, that seems to be the driving moral principle within both the Old and New Testaments, is the prescription to be holy. And to be holy means to be different and unstained by the world. In fact, that's exactly what James says true religion is to take care of widows and orphans and to keep oneself unspotted from the world. And I guess we can talk about this in a more dedicated stream to the issue of dominionism, but this sort of idea of dominionism that we have to take over these institutions to be effective, but in order to take over those institutions, you have to play the game that the institutions set. And in the end, if you're playing their game, they're not going to let you win. But even if you do win, like as you mentioned, you're so dirtied and sullied that you're really not a threat anymore. And that is ultimately what has hampered the religious right from being effective, as well as a lot of these high-profile scandals and people, as you mentioned, like Phillips. There's another one whose name escapes me. I think he was head of the National Association of Evangelicals. Had a similar scandal when he was caught having sex with a male prostitute. Things like this has ultimately done great damage to the religious right in its attempt to win back the culture. And probably that stems from a false assumption that a culture war can be waged by adopting the world's tactics.
Yes. Now, looking at, I think the actual fundamental failure of the religious right was that it didn't consistently apply its own principles. So just because the religious right was outnumbered, just because the religious right was outgunned, just because the religious right was outfinanced, doesn't mean necessarily that it was doomed to failure. There are plenty of examples throughout history where people that are outgunned, outnumbered, and outspent still win. But what is a common factor to all movements like that are that they are highly cohesive, highly organized, and highly motivated, and also gifted with shrewd leadership to take advantage of, to negate their other physical weaknesses. And the religious right just didn't have any of that. There wasn't this close-knit, almost. So, right, throughout the New Testament, we read, I think especially in 1 Corinthians, Paul talks about the church as a body, and the body, the unity of the body in the church in Christ is the goal, right? This oneness of mind and purpose. And one of the reasons why the Apostle Paul uses so many martial metaphors is because it's exactly that kind of oneness of purpose that a drill instructor seeks to get out of his men. When you read military manuals and historical accounts of battles, the generals and the drill masters are always praising the men for acting as one body to achieve a military tactical goal. And furthermore, because we are involved in the spiritual war, it's even more obviously relevant to use military metaphors. But I think in many ways these military metaphors are primarily meant to illustrate that, like a Roman legion, which would have been the primary military unit of the New Testament era, the church should be as well drilled in the arts of spiritual warfare as a Roman legion is in the arts of physical warfare, as well as in camaraderie and working together for a single objective. And a lot of that was I think misused by the religious right to argue that Christians should be actively involved in these wars in the Middle East, as was mentioned earlier by Master Sanders, which only in the end just made us look bad. And the real issue that needed to be fixed, one of unity of purpose, was allowed to get worse and worse and worse. And rather than taking its cues from the Bible and from Scripture as far as how man ought to live, a creeping libertarianism came in where, well, we're just individual self-owners pursuing our own rational self-interest. And we just happen to believe that pursuing our rational self-interest is something like, churchianity. And that's kind of where we're still stuck, to be honest. And it's actually not believing, not fully applying, at least in this area, and I think we'll get to some others as well, aspects of the Christian life to their own lived experience.
Well, and that's actually part of the problem that the religious right had, is that you're right, there was not a whole lot of cohesiveness in the movement because, well, number one, American Protestantism is not cohesive, at least not as much as it could have been years ago. You have people on all, people ranging from Baptists to Presbyterians to all sorts of other things that are just not capable of maintaining any level of unity that way. But also, I think you had a tendency among a lot of people on the religious right to ally or being willing to ally with either people with less than stellar Christian reputations or people who weren't Christian at all. Case in point, again, the Mormon Church, which the Mormon Church was, of course, vital in defeating. I don't remember if it was for or against, but they were vital in the defeat of gay marriage in California during an election year in 2008, because of the money that they were able to put into the campaign. And when the backlash against them was very strong, the Mormon Church, with a history of backpedaling theology and other practices in order to gain notoriety and acceptance, seems to be on track, although very subtly. I think they seem to be on track to accepting a lot of these things with the woke narrative, albeit in a much more subtle and slower way than many evangelicals are willing to do. But yes, I think there was not a whole lot of unity on the lower in the congregations themselves, because again, so much had been relegated of those duties been relegated to the parachurch organizations, and there really wasn't an effort on Christians as a whole to live in a distinctly biblical and holy way outside of a sort of bland morality, other than, just be a good neighbor, which even then they didn't always follow. Tithe your money, I don't know, things like that. And there really was not, as you mentioned, a whole lot of difference between the church and the world, other than the church may be, and that's not even guaranteed, nicer. So that's, if we are indistinguishable from the world, that is what makes it very difficult for anybody to be willing to listen to what the church has to say, especially when the church can't even live up to its own principles that the Bible expresses.
Exactly. And I think getting to, the root of the problem is that the foundations that the religious right were built on, they were not sound. Before the religious right could have even been in a position to wage any sort of national campaign, however we might envision that looking, it could not have been done given the faulty foundations that they had when they decided to do this. The first step should have been to reform the foundations, which nobody then, as now, wants to do. And to sort of highlight this, tied into that is the idea that something that is done locally, at home, with your friends or your family or your church, somehow doesn't matter. It's not important. The really important things are at the national level. And that's led to a complete hollowing out of these communities. So we could just imagine, a stereotypical religious right family, a husband and a wife and two kids. And the husband, because he wants to, he's gonna justify this in the sense that he's providing for his family. He's gonna be a workaholic. He's gonna be a careerist. He's gonna fight for these promotions. He's going to spend the best of his the best of his life, the best of his life energy, his first fruits, to use the biblical terminology, are not going to go to God or to his family. They're going to go to the business, the corporate enterprise that he's involved in. And he's often going to rationalize it by, well, the work he's doing is going to make the world a better place. Think of like these woke corporations, not that the religious right's woke, but how do they justify their existence? Well, we're making the world a better place. So yeah, you should be on our team because we're all in this together. And also, the money that they generated, they would donate to these institutions, these national institutions, and that would be sort of their tie. They feel good about themselves. They gave money to the cause because, hey, if I wasn't making this kind of money, I couldn't give to the cause. That's what really matters. Whereas the things that actually matter, like discipling your wife and children and providing for them in the fear and admonition of the Lord, didn't really happen. And then we could look at, the woman, her diversion, if she had one, was more likely going to be some sort of political activism, this or that trendy political goal. You have to get people to support it. You got to go out and vote for it. You got to canvass for it. That's what really matters. And submitting to her husband and loving her children, no, that's so much. That's just like, it's not important. That's not important at all. That's worthless. And then the kids are like, well, we want to make a difference too. So instead of honoring their father and their mother, they focus on going to college. They focus on an education because, hey, without that, there's no way you can make a difference. And so everybody is saying that the stuff that really matters, following Christ, building up your family, building up your church and community, doesn't matter. That's worthless. That doesn't matter at all. All that matters is the big stuff. And the big stuff might be something, like a local PTA or national politics. But always at the expense of God and then the family and the church. So the first fruits were given to things that were worthless. And it's this hollowing out process built on a faulty foundation, which has created this engine of destruction that I think has led to the failure of the religious right.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And which the thing is, if you are Christian and you purportedly believe the Bible, the ultimate goal that we have, as Christians, we are obligated, of course, first to love the Lord our God with all our heart, soul, and mind, strength, and to love our neighbor as ourselves. And that's, of course, that's best articulated, of course, in the Ten Commandments, with the first 4 being about a relationship with God, and the last 6 being about a relationship with man. And that can only be done in the concrete, right? You can only really honor God in the concrete by your own personal relationship with him and with what you do for God in your personal life, whether it's just a Bible study or joining a church and being active in that church. Those are, observing Sabbaths for rest, or whether it's with your neighbor, whether it's honoring your parents, whether it's staying faithful to your spouse. Those are the real things that you can do that can make a difference. And those are the real, because of their long-term consequences. The thing is, by focusing on the big and at the expense of the small, the only thing that has done is that it has made the foundations far more weaker. And that means when the big inevitably collapses, the fall is going to be far greater because it was built on sand and not on the rock of God's word. And so that's ultimately why the Christian right, I think, is in such shambles right now, is because there wasn't really a strong foundation. Because oftentimes the small things, the family, the local church, the neighborhood, were neglected in favor of larger and larger things, such as politics or parachurch organizations, things on that level. And in the end, we've been weaker for it. And so if we don't really start building those things again that are a bit more concrete and local, then we're not going to have a chance to reach the big if we're going to be able to affect the big at all.
Yeah, and that's sort of the tragedy of the whole religious right itself. Looking at its origins in the 70s and 80s, those things that it stood for that were good and rooted in scripture allowed it to correctly predict many of the problems we're facing today in the 21st century. And rather than leveraging that to be this new voice to help us navigate this what we might call liquid modernity, or as Rod Dreher calls it, where everything is in constant flux and nobody has any idea what's going on anymore. We could say that we were right all along. Therefore, you should listen to what we have to say as we chart through this period of chaos called liquid modernity. But no, far from it. In fact, many of the religious right, I think, are in some sense, to the extent they still exist, are ashamed of their earlier past and have jettisoned that in favor of these elements that we talked about that led to these countervailing incentive structures that ultimately hollow them out. So they've made exactly the wrong decision. And that's sort of the problem. This is what happens when you have two incompatible frameworks juxtaposed together. I mean, this kind of sounds like a victory lap for the evangelical left. We told you so. You can't serve God and mammon. But maybe we have another video on them because they've made similar mistakes, but in other directions. But regardless, I think the takeaway here is that, firstly, the religious right did not consistently build itself on the foundation of God's word, which they purported to do, and they then were caught up in the lie of the easy success of these national institutions rather than this sort of hard slog of building up local communities. It's sort of like when Samwise was tempted by the ring in The Return of the King. The ring was saying, "Hey, look, if you take me, you'll overthrow Sauron, you'll rule an empire, you can be this awesome, sagacious ruler." And then Sam realizes that that's all just a lie. It's a cheat. Really, all he can do is build his own garden up. And I think we need, a lot less Boromirs wanting to use the ring to save the world, and a lot more Samwises who know that they're not, even if they were given the ring, they'd make a mess of it.
Exactly. And I think it was a tweet that you showed me once, Todd, is that one person was observing that evangelical Christianity in the United States, which he, interestingly enough, did not make a distinction between right and left, he says it's very much like a whitewashed tomb. Unfortunately, while it's very polished and nice, and in many cases kind of given this air of winsomeness and wholesomeness, on the inside it's full of porn addictions. It's full of unfaithful spouses, sexless marriages, unruly children, absent fathers, overbearing mothers, and it's this neglect of the family, this neglect of the local church that has made them ineffective and incapable of fighting these fights. And because a lot of us, instead of tending to our gardens, so to speak, we've been more eager to get a ring that has destroyed thousands of people before, and we think it won't destroy us. And so as a result, in order to get that ring, we've whitewashed ourselves, so to speak, and it's totally fake. And I think the rest of the world sees it. And the only way that we are really going to change, the only way I think that we are really going to change is that we first of all have to fix these things on the local level first. We have to fix our families. We have to fix our churches. We have to fix our communities before we can even begin to dream to take on these national issues. Because once people start seeing what actual Christians act like, they're going to be a lot less reluctant to be hostile to them. There always will be hostility, but they'll be a lot less willing to do so because they won't have the excuses that they have now. And unfortunately, those same excuses which will be used to persecute Christians in the future.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Is there anything you want to leave us with before we wrap this up, or should we count that as your final statement?
I'm going to just say that's my final statement.
All right. Thanks again, Master Sanders. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.